And with that, I would like to invite Colin Bruce Anthes to deliver his opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Vijai. Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, Benjamin. And thank you to Brock Campus Conservatives. I'm going to begin by talking about psychology. Psychologists have found we are enormously influenced by what are called framing effects. Basically, the way a question is asked is greatly influential over the way we tend to answer that question. For instance, in Denmark, only 6% of the population had signed up to have their bodies donated to science in the event of their death as of a handful of years ago. While in neighboring Norway, over 80% of the population had. And in both cases, citizens could simply check a box to determine the outcome. So here we saw two neighboring countries answering the same question, as if they were different species. When researchers dug a bit deeper, however, they found the explanation was very simple. In Denmark, they had a default position of your body will not be donated to science, but citizens could check a box to change from the default position. In Norway, they had a default of your body will be donated to science. They'd actually answered the question very similarly, in that only a tiny number of people had changed from their default positions. They just had different starting places. Now, what's very interesting, and I suspect we shall find very telling about this topic, is that right now in the United States, among other major nations, millennials report having a higher favorability rating of socialism than they do of capitalism, with other older demographics catching up quickly. It would be an understatement to say this is happening in countries for which socialism is not the default position. This is happening in countries that were on the other side of the Cold War, whose major media outlets are capitalist corporations that get their revenue by running advertisements by other capitalist corporations, and whose citizens are hit with between 6,000 and 10,000 capitalist advertisements a day, and are 40 years into full-on neoliberal capitalism. Everyone in these societies should be signing up for capitalism, unless, to be blunt, there's something really wrong with it. I'm going to ask you to look at this question from a different starting point. It's going to be easy. I'm going to describe to you a society that's almost exactly the same as the one you're in now. Banks you use for finance the same way you use your present bank. A market sector of the same size, with independent companies regulated by supply and demand. A government of the same size, elected the same way, focused on the same basic public benefits. But some of those enterprises are structured a little differently. And I want you to imagine that those structural changes took place in the 1890s. Why the 1890s? Because they very nearly were. Around 1870, we moved from a small business economy, family farms, local shops, the butcher, the baker, the tinker, the tailor, to a big business economy, what we call corporate capitalism. And in the 1870s and the 1890s, the capitalist world had enormous economic crashes called panics, which gives you a sense of what they were like. These, of course, were precursors to the Great Depression and world wars of the early 20th century. In response to these crises, different modes of organizing production and finance became a lot more common. They worked really well. They had above average rates of success then, they continue to exist today, and they continue to have above average rates of success in contemporary practice. But they've always been primarily organized by poor people who do not control the investment of society. And so they never became the dominant mode of doing things. I want you to imagine that in the 1890s, they became the dominant mode of doing things, so that this is the world you were born into. This is what you grew up in. The banks are not corporate banks. Corporate banks, as you're probably aware, try to maximize profits for their owners by collecting as much in interest as possible. In Canada, most of our largest corporations are corporate banks. That's a big part of the reason why, prior to COVID, household debt in this country, credit cards, student loans, car loans, mortgages, your kind of debt, was $1.80 for every dollar of disposable income the average citizen possessed, and rising fast. Instead of corporate banks, you have a decentralized series of credit unions and public banks. Many of you may already belong to credit unions. They're very popular. They have 240 million members around the world. But for those who do not know, as I didn't growing up, a credit union is an independent bank, but it's a cooperative bank. It's owned by its members, the people who bank there. The primary reason they're deemed to be so much more friendly in their communities is simply that they are not incentivized the same way to write crazy things in the fine print to try to get you. You'd be ripping yourself off. Public banks, we actually used to have a version of across this country. You used to be able to do your basic banking through the post office, but the corporate banks lobbied that away in, I believe, the 1970s. But don't let anybody tell you that Alberta doesn't like socialism. In Alberta, right now, one of their most successful enterprises is their $50 billion public bank. So you have a bit more say as to where the investment goes. Your pensions aren't tied to the military industrial complex. Your banks aren't up to their eyeballs in fraud. They're not creating millions of fake bank accounts the way Wells Fargo did. Those things are different. But the way you actually use your bank and what you use it for is exactly the same. Your corporations are companies like the John Lewis Partnership. John Lewis is a British retail giant. They're one of the biggest retail companies in all of Europe. You may have encountered them at Christmas. Their Christmas commercials often go viral. Elton John going back through time, through his various pianos, until he gets his first keyboard Christmas morning as a little boy, that sort of thing. Almost 100 years ago, the John Lewis Partnership was handed down to its employees by a progressive entrepreneur. At least prior to COVID, it had grown to 85,000 employees. They all own shares in the company. And every 3 years, they democratically elect their division representatives to a workers' council in much the same way a city of 85,000 elects its ward representatives to a city council. And when the company turns a profit, as it usually does, a portion of that profit gets reinvested into the company to continue its success, and a portion gets redistributed to the entire workforce that produced that profit in the form of a company bonus. It's a democratic enterprise. In addition to democratic enterprise, you have various kinds of member and consumer cooperatives. I've mentioned credit unions, but you're probably also familiar with things like food cooperatives, housing cooperatives, solar cooperatives, internet cooperatives. Around the world right now, there are 1 billion members of cooperatives. Not because there's a huge marketing campaign to get people into them. There isn't. But because as enterprises, they have above average rates of success. And for the individuals using those enterprises, they are coherently organized in their interest. And then you have your democratically elected governments using clearly progressive forms of taxation to pay for basic, popular public benefits around healthcare, education, infrastructure, public parks, libraries, firefighters, that sort of thing. That's it. That's what you were born into. That's what you grew up in. Then there's a referendum. You can now switch from this to capitalism. And capitalism is described as capitalism. Capitalists often don't like to talk about capitalism. They like to talk about markets, which are not and never have been capitalism. Markets predate capitalism by millennia. You probably remember from your high school history courses. The ancient Greeks had markets. In the 1890s, capitalism was a very new system in the few places where it existed at all, brought about by the Enclosures Acts in Great Britain, which threw citizens off 7 million acres of land held in common, often onto the streets, with dissenters commonly shot or thrown into forced forms of labor as the property was handed over to the moneyed classes with military force. In this new system, the workers were now the capital investments of the owners of enterprise, so that the vast majority of workers now found themselves organized from above to labor for the profits of the owners. That specifically is what you can switch to by checking a box. Hundreds of thousands of low-wage workers in warehouses, undemocratically organized from above to make Jeffrey Bezos another $100 billion. Not only can you switch to that, you can pass that down to your kids. Now ask yourself, and ask yourself honestly, because this isn't about me, it's not about my opponent, this is not a contest of egos, this is about you. Would you check that box? If your answer is no, and it may well be hell no, note that we are done here. We can discuss the difficulties of changing things, but as regards the topic, if you would not check that box, there's nothing to debate. So with my remaining time, there are two key points I want to drive home. The first is everyone should be some kind of socialist. It's perfectly good and reasonable that we should debate the size of government, how much regulation is necessary, how taxation should be done. None of that has to do with capitalism versus socialism. Capitalism is not markets. Socialism is not government control. Capitalism is a division of workers and owners in which the workers are organized from above to labor for the profits of the owners. Socialism is everything that pertains to worker control of production, the working class in charge of its own affairs, and the working class getting all the wealth that it produces. That absolutely can include democratically elected governments organizing public benefits, but it also includes democratic enterprise, cooperative enterprise, and grassroots community organization. From a totally planned economy to a totally free market economy, capitalism need not enter the conversation. It is a system handed down from a pre-democratic era that never had a place in the conversation about a democratic society, and certainly has no place in the 21st century. The second point is that socialism is elementary common sense. Now, this might sound like a repeat of the first, but what I mean is that while a huge amount of money has been spent giving people the impression that capitalism, whatever its faults, is the Western individualist tradition, and socialism would be the enemy of Western individualism. Certainly, Jordan Peterson has leaned heavily into that impression to create his internet phenomenon. As we move into the industrial era, with huge machines and massive corporations, with thousands of workers in highly divided forms of labor, the notion that we had to move from a capitalist mode of production to a democratic one, just as our political systems were moving to ones in which each individual was enfranchised with the right to vote, was the Western individualist tradition from grassroots groups to practically every one of the leading Western individualist thinkers. Whether we're talking about the Knights of Labor, who considered themselves Republican Americans, arguing for self-governance in politics and self-governance in the workplace, and had 750,000 members by the 1880s. Or John Stuart Mill, author of On Liberty and Principles of Political Economy, who said that if we are to expect continuous human progress, the organizers of enterprise ought to be elected by and accountable to the people who did the work in those enterprises. Or John Dewey, the leading American pragmatist, who spent his whole career arguing that democracy was not in practice what it was in name until it was industrial as well as civil and political. Or Bertrand Russell, the Nobel Prize winning face of the Western individualist tradition, who said capitalism and the wage system are twin monsters eating up the life of the world and must be abolished, and that one very significant step would be to render democratic the governance of every organization. Or George Orwell, who said socialism is elementary common sense and blatantly obvious. If the structures and practices that I described to you did not sound radical, it's because I don't have a radical bone in my body. I am a raging moderate. I just don't take the Amazon economy as my starting point. But you're going to have to work very hard to think for yourself, because Jeffrey Bezos collected $13 billion in one day. And when Jeff Bezos gives 1/13 of what he collected in one day to capitalist causes, like, for instance, politicians in the Democratic Party, so there is no alternative, that is equivalent to 30,000 median level employees donating an entire year's salary each to a working class cause, which of course they cannot do. So you will never see this argued fairly in the mainstream. You're going to leave this debate and you're going to continue to be saturated by an illegitimate conversation over an illegitimate spectrum of options. You don't have billions of dollars, you just have what's up here and what you talk about with those around you. So whatever you do, do not let go of that question. Would you check that box? Thank you.